This is Karen with newclevelandradio.net, and it is time for the Intentionality Gurus with Candace Pollock. And today we're talking about one of my favorite subjects. It's all about stress, and it's the Mind Body series, part one. So there's going to be more, everybody. Origins of stress. And, Candace, we were talking before we got started. Stress just seems to either find me or I go looking for it. I'm not quite sure. So I'm looking forward to this discussion.
Okay, so this is kind of building on what we talked about the last time, which is the inner game impacts the outer game. And, we think of stress as being these external events and so on. And yes, that's true. External events can be triggering, but they're not all inherently stressful events. Part of it is how we're hardwired and how we're soft-wired, our habits and our past experiences and so on. And the idea in this conversation, this episode, is to kind of explore that and reveal some potential forks in the road where we have some decisions. We're going to touch on some of the neuroscience of the brain and stress, how our hardwiring, it kind of predisposes us in some ways to perceiving stress, and how in some ways it's just in us. All right, it's there as a protective mechanism.
Okay.
So describe a recent stressful event.
So a lot of stressful events, but flying is always stressful for me. And so in the past week, flying out to Texas, flying home, it just it's like I find everything seems to be going wrong for me. And externally, I don't think people notice it, but internally, my stomach is making flip-flops, my head is pounding, and I just keep waiting for myself to crash and burn. That's what stress does to me.
Yeah. Okay, perfect. And, yesterday I had a person, with an unfortunate communication style, that's how we phrase it.
Yep.
Who was almost, like one way I could interpret it is almost willingly being obtuse.
Okay.
And I must have spent like 3 hours that I hadn't planned to spend trying to reassure her and give her the information she needed and so on, only to find out at the very end of the day when still haven't responded to that because it would be way after hours. She sent an email saying, well, but I just need reassurance on this. And I want it, and it was one of those, like, no, duh, that it never in my wildest imagination would occur to me that you would have, thoughts that it would be otherwise, something very obvious that I can't share because it may,
Sure.
compromise some confidence. But the point was, in my experience, there was in part some history with this person being, for lack of a better phrase, difficult, or at least a challenge to call upon my wiser ways of being in response. And then part of it was, truly, it was almost willful, and even if I take that out as an element, it was harder than it probably needed to be if that person wasn't defensive and felt like she was being afraid that she was going to lose out on something, that she wasn't getting something. All right. So that's my take on it. And so I've been mulling it over, just how I responded to that, watching myself as a citizen scientist, trying to practice what I preach. And in the meantime, I've been doing a deeper dive into the neuroscience of how our brain works. And, stress is one of those things that I've explored. And, the idea is actually that inner game isn't just our thoughts, it's our physiology.
Right.
And I think just knowing that, at least my take, some of this I know, but it's like I know Brazil. I've never been to Brazil. I know where it is. I know some things about it. have read about, its topography, its language and, culture, those kinds of things. But I certainly don't know it. And so my idea about stress and so on is kind of like that, if that makes sense.
Oh, absolutely.
All right.
Absolutely.
So the thing to be aware of as human beings, mammals, is that, our brain structure has that primitive part that we've talked about before. In technical terms, it's called the amygdala, Amygdala. And it's part of our structure that, looks for and is responsive, finds potential danger. And it's
Right.
happening on a very primitive nanosecond way, so that we don't even have rational thought kicking in. We're just responding. And the body is, it hears a snap and there's no necessarily conscious thought in that little nanosecond. The body is on alert. And the issue with the amygdala, that primitive part, it's designed to protect us. And historically, in times when, that snap of a twig could represent, mortal danger. All right, less so now. I mean, maybe with people driving and so on, with road rage, we have to be aware of those things. And when that occurs, it's releasing neurochemicals, which then are triggering all these other bodily processes. And the idea with the amygdala is that we can be on a sustained, let's say low to medium, higher level of alertness and sense of impending, whatever the word you want to use. I don't want to say doom or harm, but something that we need to be ready for, similar to what I imagine you experienced with your trip, such that it takes less and less things to tip us over into something bigger in terms of stress.
Yep.
So what are your thoughts so far?
Wow. So I had an experience while I was away on Saturday. I was taking an Uber from my son's apartment to the campus arena where the Dallas Wings play. And I had done that 2 days before, and I had a wonderful Uber driver and everything was fine. But as I'm waiting for this driver, I was told that he was going to be there in 6 minutes. And when it was 15 minutes, I sent a message, can you give me your ETA? And of course, no response. And then about 5 minutes later, this car pulls up and it's, identified in the Uber app. And I go around the back and I check the license plate to really confirm it's the right one. Now it's a Tesla. I've never gotten into a Tesla before. And if anybody is listening, if you've never been in one, there's this piece of metal on the door, but it doesn't look like a car handle. And I'm touching it. I'm trying to figure out how to get in. And the guy, he's sitting in the car looking straight ahead, not even looking at me. So I'm fumbling with it. When I finally figure it out and I go to get into the car, I hit my head on the door frame. So, that's the first thing. Now we're driving. He doesn't say a word to me. And he takes me in a different pattern than I had been before. So now I'm getting a little concerned, like, does he really know where we're going? And I tell him, and all he does is, nod his head. So maybe he didn't speak English. I don't know. But he took me the seediest way to get there. So all I'm seeing are back roads and areas that I really don't want to be traveling through. And so I pick up my phone and pretend like I'm talking to my husband on the phone the whole way, because I figure if he thinks I'm talking to somebody, they know where I am, they can track me. I really thought I was going to die. We finally get there. I don't know how to open the door to get out of the car. And again, he's staring straight forward. My heart is pumping the whole time. I'm thinking the worst things in my mind. And, when I finally get out of the door, I stumble out and I stood there probably for a good 5 minutes because I didn't know what else to do. That's how scared I was. And I didn't want to walk into the arena and have my son see me looking like, I was in panic attack. But when I think about it, I think that it's a lot of past history that made me feel that way. Things that we've heard about, the occasional Uber driver that abducts somebody or whatever. And those were the thoughts that were going through my mind and adding to all my stress.
Yeah, and I had a similar episode when, I from the mid Hudson Valley, and I would take a shuttle down. They used to call it the limousine. We'd go down
Right.
to Terrytown and pick up a limousine, and it would take us to LaGuardia rather than having, my parents take me, to the airport or something. And one time it was a real limousine with a real chauffeur, and I got in the car, I didn't think anything of it. My mother was there. Sent me off. And then after I left, she started having those thoughts that you were having. And I noticed it was a real swanky car. It was a limousine. I noticed as we're going down the highway, the police cars would come up and kind of look in the back of the limo where I was, and then they would like fade away. And, cut to the end of the story. It turns out it was a chauffeur for a wealthy guy in New Jersey who was his boss was out of town and he was making extra money by doing the shuttles. But that's not where our brains were, like a little too much
Right.
Dateline. I don't know if Dateline was in play at the time, but those kinds of things. So chemically, you're going to be saturated in stress chemicals, and then this is going to make you even more hyper alert. And we've probably seen it in cats and possibly dogs when they feel under threat, that they're on guard. And whether we're consciously on guard or unconsciously on guard, there's something going on. And what the neuroscience shows us is that when that happens, it takes a while for our rational thinking to kick in. And there's a phrase that I always butcher, but something or other to the effect of, the amygdala has finished the race before the prefrontal cortex has even put its racing shoes on. All right, because it's all still in mini seconds, but in brain time that's like eons. All right, and it isn't just a matter of mind over matter, because the brain is a predictor of the future. And actually, there's some studies that show that it's really fascinating stuff, show that our body signals, when they put people into a functional MRI machine where it's like a video, not just a photograph, they can see which parts of the brain light up. And in one or in several studies, because they replicated it, it's well established that before a person made a decision to take action on something, the brain had already signaled as if the action occurred. All right. And so it's kind of mind-blowing that somehow the body has perceived it on some subliminal level, my layman's language, and forgive me for anybody who actually is a true scientist in this area. But we can be paying attention to that some of it, often we say, but it was this way. Like my internal conversation with myself about this person with the unfortunate communication style yesterday. Well, it was this way. Well, yes, it was that way. But my response isn't just a matter of saying, okay, we're not going to worry about that or let it go. Yes, I had some of those elements, but it was also just paying attention to, I was almost looking for it. And there's nothing wrong with that, because that's the body doing the normal thing.
Okay.
But how can we use that in our daily life, do you think?
Well, even when I was going through this on Saturday, there was a part of me that just kept telling myself to, observe it, but calm down, and that to me was a little confusing, even in my own brain, because my body internally was I could feel
Not
myself
calm.
sweating inside, not on the outside. And so I was feeling things that I normally wouldn't feel. And so that's why I kept saying to myself, this is going to be okay. This is going to be okay. But even when I got out of the car, I had to tell myself that you're all right. You're here. You got here. What you were thinking, you know, didn't happen, and wasn't going to happen. And that's one of the things I had to convince myself, that what I was thinking was not going to even happen. Before I could walk inside and, feel somewhat normal.
But we don't know.
Yeah.
All right. So it could happen the next time. And that's part of the point. So when we talk about stress, yes, we need to be doing, getting enough sleep and eating well and so on. And, the role of exercise is huge in terms of helping to moderate some of our just generic stress that's, and we can pay attention to maybe what our set point is in terms of our mood and thinking and all of that stuff that's going on. And just pay attention because, as we've said, I don't know, cajillion times, noticing is the first step, because otherwise we're just kind of blithely going through life unintentionally. And there was a phrase I heard recently, well, I can't call it to mind at the moment, but more or less, being intentional about how we're paying attention, if that makes sense. Sounds a little redundant. All right, so, it's important, again, just to reinforce this and really nail things down, to be able to shift our inner game with, some techniques we've talked about, but recognize that we may be starting out at a higher set point. And then how do we start to lower that set point? One of the things that the neuroscience shows, and we've talked about it before, is the hippocampus has been described by many like a brake, being able to tap on the brake and calm down the amygdala. But if the hippocampus is invoked too often, extremely or just chronically, it loses some of its power and it actually can start to atrophy. So it has less braking power, and it would be like the emergency brake, I guess, in a car. Probably an oversimplification. But the idea is that we can be doing daily practices, being in nature. They've shown that, as I already alluded to, getting enough sleep, because it's so easy to run out of cope when we don't have enough sleep, and not having enough good nutrition and so on. And they've done studies with children in terms of exercise, and it isn't just the exercise that is a factor in the testing. It's also the ratio of exercise, physical exercise, in relation to sedentary time. So when they did a study with their exercise, they were able to see that students did better in school, better in their social behavior, all the things that we would expect, and probably working off steam is what we have called it in the past. But when they also tracked for the ratio of how much sedentary time, like Game Boy, anybody, or watching videos, or those kinds of things. I can't imagine if it's the war games and so on at an early age that seem harmless enough, but that is exacerbating and can overtake, in my phrasing, the benefits of the recess time and so on. And we're not having as much recess time in schools. And then the studies show that the kids are starting out with less executive functions, like how to navigate life. So, I mean, what's occurring to you right now when you hear that?
Well, I see it quite a bit. It's interesting, and I hope my son doesn't get mad if he listens to this, but he copes with life when he's out among people. So at work, he's absolutely fine. Socially, he's fine, but he doesn't cope with life when he's alone, meaning that he can look around his apartment and he won't notice what he needs to do. And, I find that very, to me, that was stressful, even going to visit him. It's like, he told me for 2 days how he was cleaning his apartment, and I walked in and it was like, I wonder what this looked like before you started cleaning. Because he had dishes out and shoes out and everything. And that was stressing me. And so we talked about it. I said, how are things so organized at work? How do you do it there, but you don't do it here? And he just didn't see it.
And that's really fascinating. So how much do you think that is him being a young male? I mean, relatively young, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think part of it is, but I think also part of it is that when he's working, he feels that drive that he's got to meet all these expectations, but alone in his apartment, they're not expectations for, I think at work, they're expectations for other people to notice him. And so that he can keep rising up. But at home, who's going to notice it?
Interesting. Because I have a friend who coaches young adults, and she's done a huge deep dive into, the neuroscience and other factors related to that. And it's the executive function thing that's wanting. And I have a client who went to Boston University School of Engineering, and she shared with me that they did a study of incoming freshmen, and they have the executive skills, in essence, of so these would be 18-year-old, maybe 19-year-olds coming
Right.
in, maybe 17-year-olds. They have the executive functioning maturity of a 15-year-old, which, think of the extra stress that a 15-year-old would have, because we just haven't lived life enough and so on. In some ways, we can liken, chronological adults with them. Well, one of the other things that the neuroscience tells us is that there's different kinds of stress, right? So,
Right.
when we go to the gym, we are inducing stress when we're, lifting weights, for instance, or increasing the incline on a treadmill, or any of those things. And we think of stress in a good way. So where does that show up in your life as a rule?
Well, I do know that at home here, I do exercise regularly. While I was away, I was not exercising, and I felt I wasn't in my element. Let's put it that way. I don't think I was working at my best level the whole time I was away. I mean,
And
I couldn't
why
even get
was
in.
that concerning?
Well, it was concerning me because there were certain things that I wanted to accomplish since I had a lot of downtime, but I wasn't doing it. Or I was doing it, but it wasn't coming out the way I wanted it to. So I didn't have that energy that exercising provides me.
Yeah, it makes you wonder, people in the South, how they get anything done during the hot summer months.
Yeah,
I can't
exactly.
imagine what it was like before air conditioning and those kinds of things.
Right.
Well, and I remember, I mentioned to you that when I was little, I lived in the Houston, went to elementary school there, and I would say I love the hot, humid weather, but I was in the pool all day, during the summer months, and we'd get out of school in early May and not go back until, mid to late September, as far as I recall, because it was so darn hot, and our cars were air conditioned
Right.
at a time before that was really common, and the house was air conditioned and everything else. So the idea with with stress, the kind that we would normally invite, we can proactively think of stress in terms when we're facing a stressful situation, and knowing and accommodating and not beating ourselves up for, all right, my amygdala has had its way with me. It's sending signals, danger, danger, danger. It's trying to protect me. It doesn't know any better. It would be like a small child saying, watch out, watch out, when it doesn't know that you have, a game plan in mind. And then we can reframe it. And what they say is that if we can reframe it in terms of being helpful to someone, for instance, or something that somebody else would do. So the example is like jumping out of a plane. There was a time when I thought I wanted to, jump out of a plane with a parachute, of course. And I'm thankful that the day I went, we got all the training on how to fall, if you fell through trees, how to put your hands, and if you fell in water. And so I'm getting, more and more nervous, like none of these things are going to happen, are they? But obviously it wasn't just for the school location, but that's not how my mind was working at the time. Right. And a week before, a woman had died, or 2 weeks before, I think it was, had died because she had landed in a area, like a pond area, and got tangled in her lines and couldn't come to the surface. Thinking, okay, that's not good. Even though I was a swimming instructor and everything else. Fortunately, the wind picked up and it was too windy to go. And I've never had the desire to go again, but I was building up more and more pressure. But if I had been, in the armed services and I was a paratrooper, I would think nothing of it to jump out of a plane. And probably, I would have opted into that branch of the service with the idea that that's what I wanted to do. So the same events, different experience and interpretation of it. And so, I've shared this story before. When one of my nephews was really young, he was really scared about some event that he had to perform at. And I think he was in elementary school. And my sister said to him, oh, so-and-so, you're not scared, you're scare-sighted. And more or less, I'm excited. But it feels the same. And actually, neurologically, it shows up in the brain the same way. And so the idea is that the parts, the constriction of the blood vessels is less when we're in stress, that we don't think of as exciting. Okay. The bad interpretation of stress, our blood vessels actually constrict. I mean, that's what the amygdala is, the chemicals that are sending out, like be ready for running or fighting or, freezing. And so we're pulling the blood into the core of the body. And the other part is that with the stress as excited, it shows up in the brain in the areas that are actually associated with pleasure and elation. So I just find that okay, there really is some science behind the scare-sighted concept, that we're interpreting it in part based on our past experience of scary situations. All right. Now, in my limo ride, I was clueless. Fortunately, it wasn't until later. Now, if another episode like that happened, I was like, okay, it'd be a little more circumspect. I've, sadly have watched some Dateline things in the interim. Yeah. So that kind of sets me up for, oh, gee, I should look at this, and so on. So having heard that, how might you use this going forward?
I think it's trying to recognize, really what your situation is, being mindful. Mm-hmm. And,
otherwise known as intentional. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I'm finding that I am being more mindful than ever before. However, those little stories creep into your brain.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And I think the energy, in trying to say, stop, like when you're on an airplane and they go through the ritual, these are the emergency doors and this is how the slides work and whatever, my brain starts thinking about, oh my God, if we go down in Lake Erie when we're landing, I'm not a good swimmer. Or what if I can't get that life vest out? And I have to sort of,
Where is that life vest? How do you
yeah,
get it on?
yeah. So I have to sort of like keep stopping myself and saying, okay, just listen to where these things are, because if you listen, you're not going to need them. And so that's the way I do it. I try to calm myself down by saying, well, they're just telling you about this just in case. So just in case, this is where it is. But Karen, you're not going to need it because the plane's not going to go down. And thank God it didn't go down. So otherwise I wouldn't be here today.
But the body has more inclination to remember the negative than the positive, sadly. All
Yeah.
right, because that's the thing that's going to help you survive. So some of the things you can do without the thinking part necessarily, you do need the thinking to make the switch. But the idea is to focus on something in nature, even if it's just looking out the window, focusing on, a sound. You can rub your hands together, listen to the sound of your palms against each other and so on. And the neuroscience shows that alone will start to break the amygdala, its hold on us, so it's not continuing to send out that, danger, danger, danger. And, the prefrontal cortex is trying to do double duty and overcome the rational part of the brain, overcome, what's going on physiologically. So that's how the inner game impacts the outer game. And that's how the Mind Body series is starting. We're going to delve into some other things that I personally find really exciting.
Okay, well, I'm looking forward to it, and I'm looking forward to a less stressful day today now that I'm home. And it looks,
Almost definitely less humid, but maybe not so much after our rain yesterday.
yeah. And I'm looking outside the office window right now, and a few minutes ago it looked sunny and bright, and now it looks like it's getting cloudy. But you know what? Maybe that's what I need today. It's a rainy
A
day.
nice subdued day. We are supposed to have thunderstorms again, and it's nice and saturated out there. And aren't we lucky we don't have those droughts in the West that have started in February?
Absolutely. I totally agree. We will be back again in a couple of weeks and we'll continue this series. Thank you, Candace.
All right. Thank
Bye
you,
now.
Karen. Bye.
Bye.